days, but it's very exciting to have so many people here. So I just wanted to welcome everyone to the RS21 International Women's Day event. No more blurred lines, sexism and exploitation in the neoliberal era. We're really excited to have four really incredible speakers here with us today. I'm going to introduce all of the speakers, who will speak for around 5 to 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more. So we should have plenty of time for discussion after that. So we've got with us today Jen Wilkinson, who is an education worker, a union activist, and a member of RS21 in East London. We've got Mireia, who is a Catalonian trade unionist involved in the Indignados in 2012 and recently in the Spanish protest for abortion rights. We have Tithi Bhattacharya, who is a professor of South Asian history at Purdue University, Indiana, and has written extensively on gender violence under neoliberalism and social reproduction theory. And we've got Sarah, who is an Egyptian activist and revolutionary involved in Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment. So without any more time, I'll start off with Jen Wilkinson.
Yeah, hi, I've got the task of speaking first, so I'm trying to give a little bit of an overview, but not the normal sort of overview that you have at the beginning of meetings on sexism and capitalist crisis. So I don't want to start with the usual snapshot of where we are in terms of women's liberation today. Hopefully most people in this room know of the gains that have been made by women and the improvements in women's lives of the last 100 years. And also of the significant limitations to those gains and the need to continue to fight for women's liberation, and hopefully that's why a lot of people are here in the room. What I wanted to discuss instead is some of the more exciting theoretical developments around the issues of women's liberation and how this is both informed by and also helps us to understand the world we find ourselves in today. So what are these developments? I first wanted to go back actually to some of the debates in the 1980s, but just very briefly. Because when the women's movement began to wane, in the British context at least in the 1980s, the women's liberation movement went off in a couple of different directions. This is a very crude snapshot, so don't hold me up on the specifics. But effectively, as the class struggle began to go down, people increasingly turned away from a Marxist analysis for a way of understanding the world, and particularly for understanding women's oppression. So as the class struggle went down, talk of the power of the organised working class to change the world didn't seem to be a reality anymore for lots of people. And people either retreated into academia, this is where you saw the formation of gender studies departments around the country, and where things like postmodernism, decentered identities became significant talking points. Or people pursued what Nancy Fraser, I don't know if anybody's read her book, what Nancy Fraser describes as a breadwinner model of women's liberation. In other words, if we get more women into well-paid employment and into high-flying jobs and into top positions in Parliament, women can begin to achieve more economic independence, and we can also begin to reconceptualise gender. In other words, to get women into good jobs, we can start to think beyond women's traditional gender roles. I'm sort of arguing that it's at this point that you saw a divergence between Marxists and feminists. But what's exciting about the debates at the moment, there are several factors, which I'm going to go on to talk about, that are bringing those discussions back on to common ground and are creating the potential for a much more fruitful dialogue between Marxists and feminists. Specifically, I'm talking about the fact that the global capitalist crisis has made having a serious analysis of the capitalist system an important reference point for anyone who's attempting to understand and theorise women's oppression today. I'm guessing everybody's felt the impact of austerity on the economic crisis, and I don't need to go into the details. So theoretically speaking, what has effectively been happening is the economic crisis has seen a deepening of the attempts by the ruling class to cope with the declining rate of profit by attacking workers, both at the point of production, attacking us in the workplace, and also at the point of reproduction, which I'm going to want to develop further. In short, bosses are intensifying their attempts to make us work harder and longer for less pay because the crisis has hit their profit margins, and at the same time, the shrinking the welfare state and trying to cut the state's responsibility for the provision of social care. And as we all know, women have been at the brunt of this and are disproportionately affected by cuts in both of these areas. So I just want to examine the question of production a little bit more, because even before the crisis, in terms of women's employment, the breadwinner model has clearly been failing. It hasn't been providing desired equality for women. I was reading the TUC Women's Against Cuts thing, I don't know if anybody's read this, but they talk about the fact that even though more women are working than ever before, these are often in industries that recreate traditional gender roles, often called 5 Cs: catering, caring, cashiering, cleaning, and clerical work. And women's employment patterns more generally are making them a lot more vulnerable, and making us a lot more vulnerable to the impact of austerity. So women are more likely to work on temporary and or part-time contracts, which makes their work less well paid and also more vulnerable to redundancies. And the public sector is one of the main talking points, that 65% of public sector jobs are or were held by women, and around 2/3 of the job losses in the public sector, that was around 500,000 jobs, have been women's jobs. And because of this, on the plus side, more women have been propelled into the economic fight back and into challenging the different manifestations of sexism more widely, which is what some of the other speakers are going to want to talk about. In Britain, the growth of the number of women at work meant that for the first time in British history, the strikes, the November 30th strikes and the March TUC demonstrations several years ago were described as women's strikes and women's protests because more women were involved in those than ever before. Okay. In terms of reproduction, which I am going to go on to explain, changes in the world of work have also had a big impact in terms of women's roles and responsibilities outside of the workplace in what's often called the sphere of reproduction. I'm saying women here because although women aren't solely responsible for care, we know that women still are the majority, are responsible for the majority of caring roles still provided by women. Carrying on though, neoliberalism wants a flexible workforce to suit a 24-hour society and a global market, and it's quite hard for people of any gender to fit this in around school times and other care responsibilities, especially when those care responsibilities are becoming increasingly expensive. So as many as 1 in 4 mothers have had to give up work because they can no longer afford to pay for childcare. And this stuff comes under what is termed reproduction. So what do we actually mean by reproduction in a Marxist sense? Essentially, labour power, your physical ability to go to work, in the main is reproduced by 3 interconnected processes. So firstly, the worker needs to be reproduced. We need to be able to go to work the next day. And that involves things like eating, having a bed to sleep in, but also psychical and emotional ways that keep you feeling human. I like to watch EastEnders, it's my guilty pleasure, but it helps me to be able to restore myself to go back into work the next day. Secondly, the non-worker needs to be looked after. Those people that for whatever reason can't work, the past workers, and the elderly and pensioners and future workers, children or people that can't work for other reasons, such as disability or mental health issues. And thirdly and finally, new workers need to be reproduced. Babies need to be born, essentially. And if you think about the impact of austerity on all of these 3 areas, the impact's quite clear. In terms of the first one, our ability to reproduce our next day's labour, essentially. Cost of living is rising, food prices, energy bills, rent prices on the rise. In terms of the second area, wider care for those people that aren't working, one of the main arenas for austerity has been the welfare state, and the Tories are successfully managing to shrink the welfare state and shifting the financial burden from the state and onto the backs of working class people. So many of the services provided by the state, things like childcare, care for the elderly and disabled, are being pushed back into the home and disproportionately onto women. And then finally, in terms of childbirth, maternity leave, got some maternity departments, and the resurgence of attacks around abortion, which is one of the things I think Maria is going to be speaking about in the context of Spain, are all attacking this aspect of women's lives. How long have I got left? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, just very, very quickly. I'm going to speak a bit too fast, but I'll I just want to speak a little bit more about the contradictory vision of the Tories on these questions, because ideologically the Tories are re-promoting the idea of the ideal family, the male breadwinner, generally male breadwinner and female homemaker as a key unit in society, but at the level of social policy, in very much the same way that Thatcher did. You can see the Thatcher milk snatcher poster behind me. Their social policy decisions are actually making it very difficult for that idealised family to be realised. How are women supposed to then balance the burden of unpaid labour in the home with full-time paid labour in the workplace when both of these things are under attack? And actually you can tell from the rhetoric in the news, working class women can't really win. If you do go to work, you're often accused, if you're a single mother and you go to work, you're accused of failing to look after your children properly, leading to antisocial behaviour problems. But if you don't work and are relying on benefits, you're failing to provide an adequate role model and you're a benefits scrounger. So I know that Tippy is going to go on to explore this in a little bit more detail, but I just want to try to bring it back together for the last minute that I've got. Often production and reproduction have tended to be theorised separately, and even where they've been seen as related, they've often been treated as distinct strands with separate logics. And I hope in some of the examples that I've given, you can see that you can't treat them just as exclusive and separate strands. Just trying to think of where I can go a bit faster. And essentially, this is one of the key areas that's being debated at the moment. You can see it's signalled by a revival of interest in writers like Lisa Vogel, whose book Marxism and Women's Oppression has just been republished. And she was attempting to provide a unitary theory that brought together these two areas using Marx's capital as a starting point. Last sentence then. So, although changes in one sphere can create ripples in other spheres, making people work harder for less pay, and job cuts can cause people to lose their homes, especially when you bring the bedroom tax into play, and can cause people to experience domestic violence at home. I hope that the rest of the speakers will elaborate on those points.
Thanks very much, Jen. Next up we have Maria.
We serve the English breakfast. We take care of lovely blonde toddlers. We clean hotels. We make rugs. We learn English twice a week. We memorize the bloody phrasal verbs. We work far away. We live in overcrowded houses in North London. We say, "Have a nice day, sir." And on the phone, we lie to our moms, telling them that everything is all right. But none of these things seems to be enough to Nigel Farage. And he feels uncomfortable sitting on a train, hearing us speaking languages, foreign languages. I am sure he's fluent in several languages. I am sure he serves coffees at 8 o'clock in the morning and he cleans his own office. It's not coincidence that Farage is a xenophobe and a sexist and a member of a rich elite. It's not a coincidence that Women's Day is international and began as a celebration of women of the working class. It's not coincidence because the liberation of humanity must be achieved by the mass majority of humanity. We work, we keep our cities going, we feed the people, we do housework, and we bring up children. And so we are the ones who can change the world for the better. It's those who rule over us who change our world for the worse and who it benefits to divide and oppress us. We didn't come to the UK because we love the weather, as you can imagine. We came because in the Spanish state there are over 6 million unemployed, 20% of the active population. Among those under 25, this reaches a staggering 52%. And the worst of the crisis is falling on women's shoulders, as you know. The cuts in public services are destroying thousands of jobs with a strong gender component. During 2012 and 2013, 197,900 people lost their jobs in the public sector administration, among which 67% were women. 87% of these jobs were full-time. On top of that, women earn 22% less than men in the same job and are more likely to have part-time jobs. These are frontal attacks on working-class women, because in one hand, they destroy our traditional occupational sectors, and at the same time, they push us to make up for the social rights and provision that they are robbing us. Care and domestic work is fundamental to ensure the survival of capitalism. And if it was paid, it would represent between 25 and 40% of the GDP of the industrialized countries. These economic measures push us back to our homes, back to the old days, back to a time when we did not have control of our own lives. But this is not only a matter of the economy, it's also an ideological battlefield. The PP, our Tories, had the nerve to say in the parliament that it is motherhood that makes women truly women. The anti-abortion law conceives abortion as a crime unless certain conditions are met. When it comes to women's right to choose, the abortion reform will take women in a Spanish state back to the fascist regime. Abortion will only be possible if you can afford to pay for it in Britain, like in the 80s, when 18,000 women came to this country for terminations. This backward law is questioning women's ability to decide about their own bodies and reinforcing their role as mothers and wives at home. I ask you to participate actively in campaigning against the anti-abortion law in Spain, in the Spanish state and everywhere else, and to join the campaign My Baby is Mine. The abortion struggle is an international one, and people in Britain should offer solidarity to their sisters in a struggle in Spain. The government is sacking us from our jobs, cutting our social rights, and forbidding abortion. They oblige us to be carers, to be on casual, precarious contracts, to be immigrants, and only valid as a mother. What is left? What we can do? Feminism provides us with a theoretical framework to analyze the political and economical situation. But this is not enough. We need to bring feminism into the heart of our trade unions and make protest as a fundamental part of the struggles. And we don't do that just by celebrating the 8th of March or having a little office in the end of the darkest corridor of the Union, where a big sign, this is true, huh? I'm not inventing it. And, you know, it's a real thing that happens in Barcelona. Having a little office in the end of the darkest corridor of the Union, where a big sign says the magical words, women's officer. We achieved that by organizing the work, the jobs, where women are most present, that are normally also the most precarious and the least unionized. We have to turn even to turn even the more militant unions upside down and understand that's necessary to modernize their structures, to be relevant to casualized workers. This means going out of the comfort zone from our unions and investigating new methods. There is no liberation while there is the oppression of the female half of the humanity. And there is no really meaningful feminism without the workers' struggle to change the world.
Thank you very much. My talk is very well placed after those excellent two contributions. So much of the violence against women, as we heard, takes place within the home, as we also heard. And like many of you in this room, I find it hard to talk about domestic violence or intimate partner violence. This is because, unlike other forms of violence, this particular one presupposes some role on the part of the women, i.e., at some point of our lives, we let the violent partner into our home and into our lives. This violence then is in a way much more personally violating than, say, being attacked by the police or by a racist on the street. Because in the case of domestic violence, the violator is not a clear enemy. He once was, or sometimes continues to remain, someone close to us. This is why I want to start today with a poem by Adrienne Rich, a poem about how to talk to people who come after us about the choices we made about love. And I quote, "That the tape recorder should have caught some ghost of us. That tape recorder not merely played, but should have listened to us and could instruct those after us. This we were. This is how we tried to love, and these are the forces we had ranged within us and against us and within us." I would like to suggest that this is also the central insight of revolutionary Marxism, that there are what the poet calls forces and what the Marxists called processes within and without that conjointly determine the fate of gender under capitalism, and that we should acquire understanding of both kinds of processes, how they together influence our place in this world, so that we can fight for a better one. What do I mean by processes within and without, and how do they work? First, we need to understand the framework for the within and without, or the inside-outside question. The separation, as Jen pointed out, of the public sphere of work from the private sphere of the home or family is a unique historical development under capitalism and did not exist prior to the system's birth. Unlike the working class woman, who due to the specific nature of capitalism is often forced to remain home and raise children while her male partner works, there is no such historical counterpart in the laboring classes in pre-capitalist times. There is no unemployed housewife in pre-capitalism because there is no separation of spheres between home and work, and the family forms the site of production. Women are able to participate in production, spinning, weaving, beer making, at the same time as performing their reproductive labors, caring for children, cooking, house cleaning, etc., within the same physical space and with some control, albeit minimal, over the time of both. The separation of the public from the private under capitalism was such a radical departure from past practices that it left the new working class family completely at the mercy of capital's demands. It is hard to choose a passage which best outlines the misery of working class existence in Engels's classic Condition of the Working Class in England, as there are so many. The following provides a tragic but typical picture of the inside of a working class home, and this book was published in 1845. and I quote, "On the occasion of an inquest held upon the body of Anne Galway, aged 45 years, the newspapers related the following particulars concerning the deceased. She lived at number 5 White Lime Court, Bermondsey Street, London, with her husband and a 19-year-old son in a little room in which neither a bedstead nor any other furniture was to be seen. She lay dead beside her son upon a heap of feathers, which were scattered over her almost naked body, there being neither sheet nor coverlet. The feathers stuck so fast over the whole body that the physician could not examine the corpse until it was cleansed, and then found it starved and scarred from the bites of vermin. Part of the floor of the room was torn up, and the whole used by the family as privy." Unquote. This scenario was common in the early stages of capitalism because the system tended to pull all available bodies, men, women, and children, within the formal economy to increase profits. What is important to understand is that capital's tendency to pull all available labor power, if allowed to go unchecked, would result in the creation of an all-encompassing public sphere of production and the destruction of the private or the sphere of reproduction. And if that happened, that would endanger the system as a whole. Why does capital need a private sphere? And Jen went through that. So that the worker, whose labor power is the source of profit for capital, can herself or himself be reproduced at very little cost to the bosses. If all members of the working class family work 12 hours days in the workplace, then the vital work of replenishing labor power and reproducing the next generation remains unfinished. Capitalism thus cannot afford to dissolve the site for the reproduction of labor power, because reproduction, Marx reminds us, is the necessary condition to the reproduction of capital. Marx's understanding of the capitalist mode of production as a whole then makes the family in all its private, affective, and publicly undisclosed function an indispensable constituent element of the very public mechanisms of capitalist production, thus making the personal extremely political. If we accept, as we should, this fundamental insight of classical Marxism, then we can begin to understand how one of the most terrible damages done to this tradition was the false counterposing of class to gender. The understanding of both class as a category of analysis and the working class as an agent of history hence grew to become, and some of this is from the Second International Marxism, and I hope it comes up in the conversation, to become strangely gender neutral, and there developed an uneasy haste to prove one's commitment to working class struggle whenever questions of gender were raised. I want a new generation of fighters to read Marx and particularly Lenin in order to rediscover for themselves the insurgency that is at the heart of Marxism, a rebellious and sharp understanding of class and production that are not limited to a narrow understanding of how goods are produced. Instead, there is a need to understand capitalist production in the way Marx and Lenin originally wanted us to, as an uneven but combined process involving both formal production of goods and services and laboring processes that allow workers to do such a work. Think about a check that you receive at the end of your payday. You cannot eat the check. The check has to go through a whole process in order to reach your tummy. And that process is also part of capitalism and how that happens. What do I, sorry. Let us now take the question of violence and see, I know I'm out of time, but I want to finish with this. Let us take the question of violence and see how the within and without are related. Home is the place, the within, where the violence takes place usually, while the state is the without, where we often are forced to seek restitution or justice. There are many problems with this setup which capitalism has created for us. First, that violence within the home, in most cases, are rooted in causes that lie outside the home. For instance, research shows that domestic violence is 7 times more likely to occur in low-income families than in high-income households. Even the World Bank, yes, the World Bank, has a unified approach to the question of material well-being. And I quote from a World Bank report, "Poverty is much more than income alone. For the poor, the good life or well-being is multidimensional with both material and psychological dimensions. Well-being is peace of mind, it is good health, it is belonging to a community, it is safety, it is freedom of choice and action, it is dependable livelihood and steady sources of income, it is food," unquote. This is a World Bank report. Of course, the World Bank does its best to destroy all of those elements. Nevertheless, it is significant that they recognize that a person's well-being is connected to several factors that lie both within and without. Next, let us consider who we appeal to when we decide to do something about gender violence. Unfortunately, for most of us, it is an appeal to the various arms of the capitalist state. But unfortunately, as revolutionaries have pointed out, mainstream feminist anti-violence organizations, particularly in the United States, have essentially dropped any critique of the repressive arm of the state and regard discussion of the link between men's violence and conditions of oppression and exploitation as letting men off the hook. But several oppressed communities take the absolutely opposite approach by insisting that violence against women within their communities cannot be dealt in separation from violence done to their communities. This is what Native American activist and scholar Andrea Smith, herself a member of the Cherokee Nation, has to say, and I quote Andrea, "When I worked as a rape crisis counselor, every Native client I saw said to me at one point, 'I wish I wasn't an Indian.' My training in the mainstream anti-violence movement did not prepare me to address what I was seeing, that sexual violence in Native communities were connected to processes of genocide and colonization," unquote. In other words, we need to recognize that the dispossession of the Native Americans and the ensuing violence is one of the chief causes of gender violence within these communities. We cannot fight gender violence then by strengthening the power of the American state, which is in itself responsible for that violence. This integrated sense of a within and without, a public and a private, needs to animate all our struggles in our fight against capitalism in its neoliberal phase. This is particularly urgent as the tools for ordinary people to fight back have been so ruinously damaged by 40 years of neoliberal assault. This is particularly true of the primary organs for fight back in the workplace like trade unions, whose power and membership have been reduced by this prolonged one-sided class war. How do we build back our class power and confidence? It is not enough to say that people should join unions. Of course they should. But in many working class communities, for instance like those of the American South, the class memory has been lost as to why people need to join unions. The New York Times reported on why workers at the Volkswagen plant recently voted against joining the union. One worker said that workers in the South were hereditarily anti-union. What that really means is that the memory of union power has not just been lost from the workplace, but also from the wider community. And in order for a union drive to succeed, it would have to be rebuilt from scratch from the community up. This is precisely what the union, the United Auto Workers, did not do. In the case of this particular union drive, they signed a neutrality agreement with the bosses, which said that they were not going to do one-on-one meetings with workers at their homes. House visits are a common tactic used by union organizers to build trust with workers. It also gives union militants an opportunity to feel the pulse of the place where the worker lives, breathes outside of the workplace, and UAW told the bosses they were not going to do it. A union which did get this balance right in recent times is the Chicago Teachers Union, we have to bear in mind, as many speakers, as both the speakers before me has said, that part of neoliberalism's attack on public sector has to do with the fact that capitalism wants to reduce public support for the process of reproducing labor power and push that work completely onto individual families. So how did the Chicago Teachers Union rebuild their union? By doing what the UAW didn't, which is connecting the struggles in the workplace with the needs of the community. Our working conditions, this was the slogan of the union, our working conditions are your children's learning conditions. And that one formulation drew together the teachers, the parents, and even the children in this groundbreaking struggle against one of the most powerful men in American politics today, Barack Obama's close ally, Rahm Emanuel, and they won. But in order for this connection between workplace and home, or workplace and community, to take place, we need to reignite our understanding of capitalism as a totality. This means that socialists and revolutionaries need to be at the heart of these struggles at both the workplace and outside of work. It is because, I am told, revolutionary Marxists are involved in the SOAS cleaners fight for justice that I see questions of immigration, race, and why we need to open borders repeatedly being raised in what is traditionally a workplace struggle. So let me conclude by saying this. In order to fight neoliberalism, we need a revolutionary Marxism that is clear-sighted about its own history and unafraid to pursue its own analytical conclusions about the totality of capitalism. While I agree with my poet that in the here and now, we fight the forces that are within us and ranged against us. In that battle, however, I take my lead from Marx, who asks that while we do fight for an equal place at the table, we never lose sight of the fact that as revolutionary Marxists, we are here to ultimately upend that table. Thank you.
Okay, so I will be basically speaking about sexual violence in Egypt. I will be focusing on Egypt for this. I won't be looking at the theoretical framework. I will be more or less looking at on the ground of what we did, as I have been part of a Kentish and I'm still part of this organization. So let me at first just point out that if we're going to speak about sexual harassment in general, so on the individual level, it's culturally embedded in our society. However, I'm not going to focus on this part. I will mainly focus on state violence during the revolution. Before getting into Upantish and what we have done and why we were established, let me just sum up some of the major state violence events that took place against women during the revolution, even before Upantish were formed. So the first one, it was basically on the 11th of Feb, the day where we toppled Mubarak. So this example, I won't recall it as a state violence because it was more or less, sadly, a sort of celebration. So what happened is that there was Lara Logan, the CBS reporter, who was assaulted by a group of Egyptian men, sexually assaulted. And it was basically like, I don't have any explanation for this unless it was a sort of celebrating this thing. So this, in a way, it shows you that we're still living in this patriarchal system, in the sense that those men who went off the street with them, calling for freedom, bread freedom, and social justice, they're the one who are contradicting the same principles against us. So they're basically contradicting themselves in the sense that they're abusing our rights while they're calling for other rights. Other examples that would be more or less related to state violence is the famous case of Samira Ibrahim. So basically, on March 9th, the army decided that they want to clear out the square. So they cleared out the square through using violence, and they arrested a couple of female activists, and they arrested them in the Egyptian Museum. And what happened is that they those girls were forcibly exposed to virginity tests, and they were stripped of their clothes, and the male soldiers were filming the process where the doctor was doing the test. So, of course, the people who were backing Samira Ibrahim was basically no military trial for civilians. They did their best in order to make some of the activists to speak out about this case. And Samira Ibrahim did that, and she brought a case against the military before the court, and she accused them of such violation. And the way they defended themselves, the military, it was basically, this is a routine that should be done in order to prevent any charges or any one that would accuse us that we have raped those girls or anything. So it's just a routine. And the person who was basically stating that in the court was Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's now running for the presidential elections in Egypt. So this is how sad it is. So, and then I will move to the third incident, which is quite famous in the Western community, which we call it Sitt al-Banat, the best of all women, and it's famous by the blue bra. So she was basically stripped off, dragged, and beaten up in the streets by the army. And when another girl, she was passing by, named Azza, she tried to help her. See, she was subjugated to sexual violence as well. And then afterwards, after this incident, the army arrested many activists, both males and females, in the Shura Council, and they were threatened by rape and sexual violence. So this is basically, there's plenty of examples about sexual violence during the revolution, but this is mainly the major events that I would like to share them with you. In order to show that sexual violence, it wasn't just because basically Pantash was mainly established during the Muslim Brotherhood. However, we can't deny the fact that sexual violence was used by the SCAF as well, was used by the military as well. And the Pantash was as a reaction to those accumulation of the extensive sexual violence that was used in Egypt. I don't think I will be sticking to the 5 minutes. I still have. Sorry. Anyway. So, let me get to Upantish. So, under the Muslim Brotherhood, on the 23rd of November 2012, we went off the street to protest against the constitution amendment that gave Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, unlimited powers. So we went off the streets and we were protesting like any other day. And then the other day, I went to one of my friend's places in downtown. And then one of my other friends, she was so traumatized, and she was swearing at Egyptians, and she was like, she's not proud that she's Egyptian, and she just wanted to fled the country and to go to any other place. And I was like, oh, you're bullshitting. Of course there is rise and falls in any revolution. What are you talking about? Is it because Morsi is having unlimited power? What about the SCAF? And we went through the same thing, and we have to resist, blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't really understand, why is she saying this? And she's like, okay, let me tell you something. My sister, this sister is another friend of mine. Yesterday, she was raped by 500 plus men. So she was basically, her sister and another friend, which later on she went to the public and she shared her story called Yasmin al-Baramawi. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her name. They were both stripped of their clothes in few seconds, raped by sharp objects and fingers, and dragged while they were threatened by sharp objects from Muhammad Mahmoud up to Abdin. This is like a distance like as if you're walking from Houston Square to Warren Street, for instance. So she was dragged all the way around, and she was threatened by sharp objects, as I just mentioned, and they were both raped. And then afterwards, when I met my other friend, and I knew the entire story, she told me that she fell into the sewer, and when you hear such things, so you think that it's over. No, it wasn't. So they kept on trying to pull her out, and while they're putting their fingers in her pants, or not her pants, because she was obviously stripped off her clothes, but you can tell where they were putting their fingers. So, and she told me that she had to beg some random man that she's a mother and please save me. And he basically saved her because she's a mother. So when I heard the story, of course, like my friend, when she was telling me the story, she was looking at, like she was putting the Egyptian men in one block. Of course, I won't deny the fact that sexual harassment or sexual violence is a culturally embedded thing in our society. But the way she was telling the story, when you listen to it, you'd feel like, this sounds a bit weird. It seems that it's quite systematic. And you'd feel that, like, as an Egyptian, you know that Egyptian would never have the guts to strip off someone from his clothes completely in a few seconds, and with this mechanism, you feel like there is a certain of, like, they're kind of professional, they know what they're doing, and each one knows what he's basically doing. In a few seconds, she would be raped. So I called a couple of activists and I told them that we need to do something about this. We shouldn't be silenced about this, because if we do so, this means it's the end. It's over. So a couple of my friends, they called me and they told me that they're doing a meeting, which was with Kantish, in order to stand against such thing. And what we were doing, basically, we don't call ourselves as, Kantish, it stands for Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment Mob Assaults. So we don't call ourselves as a rescue team, because basically, in most of the cases, we're trying to make the experience less harmful and less horrific. Like, for instance, let me put it that way, instead of being raped by 500 men, she would be raped by 10 men. So this is why we don't call ourselves as a rescue team, because they're that professional that you can't really intervene at the right time and to get her out before she was assaulted or raped or she was exposed to such thing. Okay. So, sorry for that. So we have three groups. Basically, the first group it works on the square, where we raise awareness. And when they speak about raising awareness, we don't raise awareness in the sense that we go and speak to the people about sexual harassment. No. We raise awareness in the sense that we're informing people, we're sorry to tell you that the Tahrir Square is not as utopian as you think. There is sexual violence that is taking place in the square, and you should be aware of this. And we spread our hotlines, and we tell them that different types, like we, in a way, from our experiences and our intervention, we knew the patterns, how it looks like, and how is it to be. So we would tell them, inform them, how would you notice that this circle, there may be a girl inside, and what you should do afterwards. So this is how it was. And then we had the safety team and we had the intervention team. So of course, because we haven't received any training, we're not specialists in such type of work, we were new to such thing, we're just ordinary people like you guys. So we have to develop our mechanism until we just allocated, like for safety team, they would be responsible for the cause in the sense that as soon as the intervention team, get the girl out of the circle of help, we just throw her in the car and they just run. Because it doesn't mean that you're in the car that you're safe. You will be followed by folks as well. And I have witnessed that by myself, that I was in the ambulance and they ran after us and they broke the glass, the car glass. So, and then we have the intervention team where we basically, each one has a certain number and each one knows exactly, and this is of course the mechanism that I'm telling you about. It was after many experiences and after many interventions. So this is not how it started, and you can ask me afterwards how we started and how we thought of dealing with this thing. But each one of us has a certain number, so we basically we just get inside in a certain line, and each one is should be standing in his right number. And as soon as we get into the circle, we do a cordon around the girl, and we try to get her out of the circle of her. One of the points that I would like pointing out, the first thing, women involvement in the punish. So basically, the number of women who were involved in Pantage, it almost exceeded the number of men. And we had so many debates about this, especially the intervention team, which is I'm part of. So basically, many guys, many males, they were arguing that we should exclude women from the intervention team because basically we're trying to rescue a girl. So how we will be rescuing a girl and at the same time we're taking care of other girls who are our team. And we went into so many discussions with them to prove to them it's not about your gender, it's about what you're capable of doing. And we proved it. And I remember that before coming to London, in my last meeting with the Pantish, many men, they stated that they would never have believed that women would have been capable of such thing unless they have been experiencing it. And they have seen women who have been more brave and courage in doing such acts and intervening and getting the girl out of the circle. And most of the cases, it was basically girls who were managing to get the survivor out of the circle of hell. The other point is that we lost the support of the Altus group, which is a football fan entity, because they were basically, in order to collaborate with us, we have to exclude women from being involved in this operation. So this is why we lost the support. I would also like to point out the radicalization of the women movement in Egypt. So basically, the first events that I have mentioned at first, it was followed by a series of women marches. And here's one of the pictures of the most common known women marches. So it was followed by a series of women marches. And I'd like to point out that during this march, it was right after the Blue Bra. So at that time, people were just, they left the street, and because it was during the time of the parliamentary elections and blah, blah, blah. And women marches, it gave another rise to the revolution, okay? So it made, like, it mobilized the people in one way or another to go again on the street. In this women march, as you can see there are some males making like a sort of cordon around the girls. So this is how it started. It started that our male colleagues, they would say that we will be protecting you by doing a cordon in order no one to interfere or abuse you. At first, like, we just made it happen, but at a certain point afterwards, we refused. Okay, I'm usually we refused. So at a certain point, we refused, and we found that we can defend ourselves. And especially after the mob assaults, the organized and systematic thing, that we don't have hard evidence to prove that it was a state violence, but you can tell from the way it was done that that those people were sent by the state, whether the Muslim Brotherhood or the police. So in the other picture, you'd find we used knives and sharp objects as a symbol of resistance, that we can do it by ourselves. So you'd see even this, the radicalization of women movement, you'd see it even in the women marches themselves and how they use different tactics in order to make their point. The other thing, one of the major objectives of us as a group, we're not here to rescue to arrest the perpetrators, because it's a very tough job and it's not our task. Our main goal is to get the girl out of the circle of hell. And one of the main reasons, in order to send a message that this is not going to be a mean in putting down the revolution or the protest. You're not going to terrify us.
and we will resist. And this is not, and this was basically supported that many women who has been subjugated to sexual violence, they came up to the media and they spoke their cases out, which in one way or another, it made a very important point that I'm not going to accept to be blamed of something that I'm not ashamed of. I'm not the perpetrator. And
Because we need time for discussion, I'm really sorry.
okay, it's fine. So maybe I can just
You'll
show the
be
videos.
given a few minutes back at the end.
Yeah, maybe if you have any questions about what I'm saying, or you would like to know some of even my personal views or my personal experience, you're free to ask me. But can we show?
How long are the videos?
Can I show at least? Okay, so I am having 3 videos. Maybe I can propose them.
Okay, well maybe what we can do is we can post them up at the end.
Okay.
Because we've got hardly any time for
Perfect.
discussion. I want to hear from the people in the room.
Okay.
But thank you very much. We haven't got as much time for discussion as we had hoped. So if people could keep their contributions really short, feel free to ask any questions, make any contribution. It would be great to hear from people who are involved in campaigns around here as well. So I'll open up, if you just stick up your hand and then I'll point at you. I'm going to see if a woman puts up their hand first, just because I think it's good in these meetings to start with a woman. Yes, thank you. I'll call you next.
Absolutely fascinating. I could talk for hours about what each of you said, but I just want to say 2 things really quickly. One is to bring a message that isn't inside the room, which is a complicated message about violence against women, because it's about what happened in Sweden on International Women's Day. I don't know how many women know, but biggest International Women's Day marches in Sweden for many years, particularly in Stockholm, very much led by young women. But the demonstration in Malmö was attacked by the far right, and a whole number of people were hospitalised. There's a young man, 26-year-old migrant, found a member of their equivalent of football against homophobia, still in a coma in hospital. So I just think it's important to spread that message, because I think it's an indication of kind of an aspect that the panel didn't have time to deal with, between state violence and individual violence. I think the far right are going after feminists because they understand that what we've got to say is quite a powerful message. So, you know, there's stuff out there, but I think it's important to send the message. And then just very, very quickly on the situation on abortion in the Spanish state. We have one of the strongest abortion laws in this country because we were able to get the Trade Union Congress to call a mass demonstration of women in defence of the 1967 Act. And I think what Maria said about the importance of mobilising in the workplaces is incredibly important. We have to do everything we can to get our unions to come out in solidarity with women in Spain, because what's happening in Spain is also happening in other parts of Europe, and it's certainly happening in the States, as Didi could tell you, at great length. So, you know, we also need to look at that, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and get people to keep your contributions to 2 minutes. When I go like this, like, let someone else speak. Not that you usually keep it too long, just as a general, you over there at the back.
I didn't manage to catch on you, but there was just one point I wanted to make to you,
Can you
I
please
think-
raise your voice?
Yeah. I was just saying that I think having women involved in getting women out of the group would have actually empowered the women involved, if that makes sense. Like, I don't understand the reasoning behind that.
The reasoning behind
Not allowing women, trying the argument around women in the group.
women being involved were empowered. So you mean like the survivors were afterwards empowered in one way or another?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Definitely.
this happened, and this was one of the good. Okay.
Yeah, I'll let you I'll tell you when you can speak again. Thank you. I'm going to Sarah next. Yeah, I wanted to come back in on some of the issues that Tiffany and Jen picked up, because I consider myself a revolutionary socialist, and have been for over half of my life now, but I think we've got a great task in front of us that's been outlined. I think what we need to do is look at the theory, again, that Marxism is a theory, but also something that we can put into practice that can address the roots of women's oppression and lead to liberation. But I think we need to do some work around it, and I think the left has been lazy. I think there are reasons for that I don't have time to go into, but we've got a great tradition to contribute. But more importantly, I think we have to look for real opportunities to agitate. So I think this is another area of weakness. And I think too often on the left, I have heard, comrades say to me that really we can't address issues of women's oppression until we see an upsurge in class struggle. Undoubtedly, when you see class struggle on the streets, as in Egypt, that is a context where we can really make huge gains. But that's not to say that we withdraw from the battle on a day-to-day basis. And I think this is where we need to do some work. And I think there are real opportunities in the context that we find ourselves in today that is different from the 80s. That's why we've got some catching up to do. But if we don't catch up, we're going to miss huge opportunities. Because we've talked about several decades of neoliberalism. That capitalism has got an inherent contradictory dynamic within it anyway. But I think neoliberalism is exacerbating that. I think we're in a unique position because of, as people have said, the role and place of women in the workplace today compared to 30, even 40 years ago. We are very much part of the working class today. You can't deny it. Now, it's not the breadwinner model that I think we espouse as revolutionary socialists. It's not just about going out and having a wage that's going to liberate you, although undoubtedly economic betterment is something we welcome. It's about your relationship within the workplace, not only to your fellow colleagues, but also to your employer, that opens up possibilities for collective action on a scale that alone in the home or maybe in your, in your communities you don't have. You do have a source of power to bring production to a stop. If you go on strike, your factory doesn't work that day. So that's important. But it's not just that, because of the reasons that Tiffany says. In some places you're not organised. Many women are working part-time or not sufficient hours to make up to be able to participate in the way that they would like. But increasingly, I think, because women are now part of the world of work, because of the pressures that austerity is bringing down to bear, what we're seeing is that work in itself is no longer the path to liberation and out of poverty that it once was. The poor in Britain today, many of them are working poor. The same would be true in the States. There's an unshackling of that. But we still have to fight, of course, in the workplace for betterment. But increasingly, those demands are demands that impact outside the home as well. For women workers, rights to maternity leave, always under attack. Rights to flexible working, always under attack. These are issues for women, but they're also issues for the classes, affect our male comrades and our relatives as well. But it's not enough just to do it in the workplace. We have to go out into the community. My union is Unite. It is, as far as I'm aware, the only union that has community branches. We are not doing enough with this, but I think it is a real step in the right direction. I think the question for us today is, we need to talk about women's liberation, but we also need to get out there and practice it and put it into practice with real strategies that can move the struggle forward. Thank you.
And it was just really quick, actually, just about the abortion stuff, because I know you were talking about the gains that we made in 1967, but recently, and I think the reason it's important to show solidarity with our Spanish sisters is because actually we can see that that's going to start getting rolled back. I've been recently doing some secret undercover work where you go into abortion clinics, not abortion clinics, they're kind of, so doctors will advise you to go to them, but they're not state funded. They're sometimes in churches. And basically, if a doctor thinks you're unsure whether you want an abortion or not, they'll send you to these places. And we've been going around to them and pretending we're pregnant and need advice. And they give you incredibly inaccurate advice. They tell you that you are vulnerable and don't know what you're doing, and this is the hardest decision you'll ever make. And there's been evidence of people, of advisors saying that you can develop cancer, that you'll never have children again. And what we're going to see is if the state gets cut back, then the doctors are going to rely more and more on these kind of clinics. So that just shows the importance of getting involved not only in solidarity with Spain and America, but also what can we do today? In our local RS21 group, we're thinking about going to some of the sometimes you see people outside abortion clinics in Brixton. So what can we do around that? Can we organise people to go and disrupt it and say, look, we're proud to have an abortion, we're fine with this. Like, what can we be
Yes.
doing around that? So I think that's something to think about.
I had a question primarily for Tithi on the issue of sexual reproduction. And it follows on from an RS21 branch meeting we held a couple of weeks ago, which had quite an interesting debate on the question of whether oppression, sexism, racism are necessary for capitalism or not. And one comrade argued that it's necessary for capitalism to make profits. It's not necessary for them to oppress black people or women. They will do that if it can aid the process of making profits, but they will also say bring women into the workforce or argue that black people are equal. So capitalism has this kind of contradictory relationship to these oppressions. On the one hand, it relies on them to keep the system going, but on the other hand, it had a very historically different relationship to them. I mean, women have entered the workforce on an extraordinary scale over the past 100, 150 years, which has transformed the whole question of sexism, women's rights, and so on. But at the same time, the problems persist. You see curious things like institutions like gay marriage are being brought in, which clearly don't have the official reproduction function that marriage used to have, yet they play an ideological role. Now, I was wondering whether the social reproduction arguments that you're bringing up can help cast some light on this question, because I have to say I can't really work out the answer to it. Capitalism seems to need women as workers and therefore women as subjects, but it also seems to need women as objects and women as targets of oppression. And it seems to somehow do both and neither. And I was just wondering if you could, if the issue of reproduction is what perhaps can shine a light on that problem.
Thank you. I've got Rachel.
Yeah. Hi. I just sort of wanted to add in like a really quick comment. Just that when we talk about violence against women, I feel like it's really important to explicitly mention the violence against trans women, because I've seen it quoted that they're the most murdered minority in the world. I think for us to talk about gendered violence without trans women here and not explicitly mentioning them is something that maybe, I don't know, I just feel like, you know, we see within the prison industrial complex, you know, restricted access to services for women. I just feel like in this context it is important to bring that up. So thanks.
Okay. You mentioned before something that is normally talked in revolutionary organizations. Maybe capitalism needs exploitation of labor to work, but maybe it doesn't need women's oppression to function. So that, I think, that doesn't make less important because there is oppression now, so I want to fight against that. So even from a selfish point of view, I think that fighting that oppression is important, because without the half of humanity, we will not win. So first that. So now we want to fight that. How we fight it? I think it's very important. I really appreciate your exposition of the how capitalism exploit women, especially, etc., etc. But I think we have another. The other point of the analysis should be what is that exploitation, because we have the most evident cases here, for example, but there are a lot of other things. For example, a lot of people think that there's no reason to be a feminist today because that's overcome. And no, there's what some people call the new sexism, that is made of language, is made of certain attitudes, is made of things that we have in our subconscious, and we learn from. We have 1 year when we are learning this. So, and at such point that even if we as revolutionary don't fight back and don't swim against the current, we fall into the same errors. So my most valued experience as a revolutionary in Spain was learning how, as an organization, we we understood this thing, this new sexism, and understood that we have to learn a lot of things, no, and not only that women earn 20% less than men, but also that we can be sexist too. And if we don't understand that, we are missing a very big part of the analysis, I think.
The first question is for Tiffy. There was a couple statistics / things that you cited, and I didn't really get the point. So domestic violence is 7 times more likely to happen in low-income households. Underreporting and the fact that rich people get away with murder is obviously contributes to that. I just want to know what the point behind that is. Why are poor people just more likely to be, wife beaters or rapists? And the other was with regards to indigenous people, so in America, and rape incidences and incidences of other forms of violence, again in that community. And again, I didn't get the point of that because I don't know, were you saying that it occurs more in those societies than it occurs in white societies? I just didn't really, what's the point of that? It just seems highly offensive, possibly. And Sara, the first thing you did when you started your talk is you spoke about rape being culturally embedded in our societies. No, patriarchy is embedded in all societies, and there's cultural variations on patriarchy that might show themselves differently depending on whether you're from Egypt or India or here. But that's what's embedded in our society. And the other thing is, Lara Logan was not the first woman or the first big case of rape. She is the first white woman whom the West cared about, and that's why everyone knows about Lara Logan. But the 6 truckfuls of people, women and men, that were arrested on the night of the 25th of January saw sexual violence at the hand of police officers in the cars and in the police stations. And again, throughout those 18 days, later on, magazine got hundreds of women coming forward and saying that in fact there was a lot going on. So I just wanted to kind of black down on that. Thanks.
I have David next.
Yeah, just a sort of quick question, building on something Tiff said about how we shouldn't counterpose fighting women's oppression with fighting capitalism, and from whatever they're saying how certain people on the left have been quite bad at this, about saying how, well, women's oppression is obviously a problem, but we need to solve that after the revolution kind of thing. But I was thinking actually, thinking about how we all know kind of how capitalism generates its profits through exploitation, basically get the workers to do their work, pay them less than value they're producing. But given that women and migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, are systematically paid less than men, as well as being oppressed, they're actually, I think based on that analysis, actually more exploited. So then there is actually a genuine intersection between this oppression and this exploitation, and exploitation. So presumably, therefore, actually, I don't know that maths, but presumably capitalism does actually make more profit per worker on employing women and migrants. So how do we build that sort of analysis into our strategies around sort of workplace organising? It seems to me like we do actually need to bring, as a matter of urgency, bring a lot more women, a lot more migrants into sort of trade unions and into organising, and that's really not a secondary, that seems to be even more important than just trying to build them without really thinking about who's going into.
Shanice?
Very briefly, I wanted to talk about stuff that we've been doing at King's and how I think it's important not to abstract the question of women's oppression from the question of capitalism. So just to give a few examples, maybe to come back on Hannah. She's in the line. Oh, right, okay. To come back on Hannah's point about gendered violence in working class families. I was at a brilliant meeting that Tiffy did at King's last week, and you know, the argument is basically that during times, specifically within a neoliberal period where you're getting cuts to welfare and the drawing back of social provisioning, this creates the phrase that Tiffy used was like pressure hothouse, pressure points within the family. You know, there's less opportunity to eat, there's less opportunity to pay rent. Combine this with notions of femininity and, you know, who's meant to be providing the dinner on the table. It creates, you know, the conditions of possibility, as Tiffy said, for gendered violence. And that's why when you've got low-income families who are struggling to feed themselves, struggling to look after their children, struggling to put food on the table, that you get increased levels of gendered violence in specific. But also look at what's happening at universities in terms of lad culture. You know, you've got this really horrible way in which women's bodies are being exploited on campus for the fun, laughs and jokes of lads who are engaging in banter. But ultimately this is also connected to the process that's occurring post-women's liberation movement under capitalism. It's the, you know, it's the expression on campuses of the commodification of sexuality in general and the commodification and marketisation of women's bodies in specific. So again, importantly, it's, you know, we need to be connecting questions of women's oppression to their broader place within capitalism. But also, I can quite proudly say that King's recently won the living wage, actually today, for all cleaners at King's. But one of the main things that I tried to stress in the feminist society at King's was look at the proportion of cleaners at King's who are migrant women. The reason why Rick Traynor took 4 years after he promised to pay, you know, the cleaners the living wage is because he saw that there were migrant women and saw that, okay, you know, they're oppressed and exploited, they've got little money anyway, they're not going to fight back, I can do what I want with them. Actually, we built confidence, student and worker solidarity, etc., etc. And look, now these migrant women have the living wage and can actually provide for their kids and put food on the table. So again, we need to be connecting the issues of exploitation, outsourcing, marketisation of jobs on campuses with the broader question of immigration, migrant rights and women's oppression, and bringing all these things together and hopefully, you know, then unite in a big movement and smash the system.
For a little bit, so I've got 3 more people who have indicated to speak, so if you could all be really quick, and then I'll be able to give a little bit of time to the speakers to come back. So Arnie, I've got you next.
You described like social reproduction as sort of like a process within like labour power. As from what I understand is that there was a debate, at least in the 80s, whether it was sort of subservient to production, whether actually social or reproduction itself was a separate thing. Do you think that sort of, do you think Marx's sort of scant analysis of social reproduction as in and of itself is a reason, one of the reasons why today we sort of have a counterposing of economics to, or exploitation to oppression, and how that has effectively sort of reflected back on the whole Marxist movement is that you have this sort of workers class sort of prioritization over other such struggles in subordinate groups, for example, whether it's women or brown race. Also, how do you, I think social reproduction is very useful in terms of especially describing some of the more specific social relations between men and women today. For example, I don't see much analysis on not just like oppression on women, but why men oppress. And I think one of the first people, or the only person I've come across it, is Jeff Hearn, who analysed masculinity and where it actually comes from. And he's tried to place masculinity as sort of developing within social reproduction, not just to, as a way of further controlling, for example, the different types of reproduction. So physical reproduction, if you look at the attack on International Women's Day by fascists, if you look at sexual reproduction, the way in which abortion rights are attacked, there's all these different types of reproduction, and within all of that, there's a specific type of control by men to not only maintain their position in society, but also further perpetuate and develop it. So, I mean, there was a question, do you think Marx's, essentially his position within society when he was writing Capital, neglected a proper analysis of social reproduction because he himself was essentially a patriarch within his family. He did have oppressive relations with his wife and with his sister, and because of that bias, he sort of inherently neglected that. And if you do recognise that, do you think that today Marxists need to have a serious look at Marxism and in capital and come up with a serious resolution to that and that a lack of analysis around gender oppression?
Just as a response to Arnie, there's a really great book by Heather Brown, which is about constructing gender theories about gender from Marx. She goes into quite a lot of detail about separating out Marx and Engels. So it means you don't just repeat the same old debate about the origin of the family and that. So, and also just about another quick point, the ways in which we've been talking about the family has been like very much like seesawing between Victorian kind of ideals of the family and then a 1950s America. And actually, if you look at what people do on a daily basis, like I understand that the family is an ideology used to push women into a certain position, and that it's used in the private sphere to keep men and women very separate, but that's a position used by capitalism as a strength from their side. And I think, like, we should. Last night, with BBC News, for instance, they were showing how the economic, the recovery is affecting people up and down the country, and they were saying, oh yeah, look at this family, they're doing great. They're working 12-hour shifts alternately, and they're having to do like 3 days childcare, 12 hours, and they might see their kids, they might not, who knows? And this is apparently what's the economic recovery. This is what working class families are facing. So that's just an aside. The main thing I wanted to talk about was particularly about your comments on reproduction and about how without there being a certain element of the private sphere, capitalism grinds to a halt because families have to exist in some sense, and they have to be able to build homes and feed themselves and pay their checks in. But I just want to talk about what's happening in healthcare right now, in that it's the people from the right position who aren't productive enough, who are effectively facing the strongest cuts in their healthcare provision. So migrants, people who are out of have chronic illnesses or out of work for long periods of time. Those are the people that perceive not to be productive enough, and those are the people that the NHS restructuring is hitting the hardest. So I was wondering, when do you think the state this cushion is going to exist? I mean, are the capitalists going to be able to keep providing healthcare because that's what their workers need, or is it actually just going to get squeezed down the plug hole? And my theory is probably the second. So,
thank you. And just, kind of.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on Bat's question about whether oppression is necessary to capitalism. And the way that I see it is that profits are necessary to capitalism, oppression isn't, but the process of creating profit, of capital accumulation, is what generates the structures and the ideas and the processes that create oppression. And so the kind of processes that Tiffany talked about, the contradiction, and this is where I think Marxism and social reproduction theory is incredibly important in understanding that it's very contradictory in terms of how it plays out in terms of capitalism, because capitalism both needs women's labour in the public sphere, but it also needs women's labour in the private sphere to produce the next generation of workers. And the solution that has been come to at different points has changed. So when capitalism is beginning, you see a drive to push women back into the home because the breakdown of the family is threatening the future generation of the labour force. But what you've seen as capitalism has developed is increasing numbers of women being sucked into the workforce, but at the same time being expected to carry the burden of that private reproduction. But I think it's also important to point out it's not just something that glides along and that happens at a structural level in terms of capitalism. It's also something that women have fought for, the right to be in the workplace. And one of the problems that we've got is that the big expansion of women into the workplace happened at a point where our class was on the defensive and was being defeated, in the period post the big upsurge in the 1970s. And so you see women going into the workforce, but actually you see inequality and sexism being exploited by the bosses. So you see the majority of women in part-time work on low pay, and the picture is getting much, much worse now because of austerity and because of the crisis. And so that if you look at the most recent calculations, a woman in a couple to go out to work without working tax credits will now gain nothing, but will lose an average of £2,000 per year to go out to work. It's really, really shocking that it actually pays women now to stay in the home rather than to go out to work. But just to finish, I thought I really liked the way also people were talking about how social reproduction theory and Marxism is important in terms of understanding things like domestic violence that can feel so very private. But I think also in terms of understanding the way in which the states and the bosses do very directly police women's bodies as well, whether it's the export processing zones where you see rape and harassment being used very directly by bosses to police women, or when people resist, as we've seen in Egypt, but also in Britain. One of the most recent scandals that has come out about how undercover cops had relationships with, slept with, and had children with women whilst they were acting as undercover cops on protest movements. And I just want to flag up, on Tuesday, some of those women are going to court, because we've seen all this stuff about the Stephen Lawrence report and how shocking it is, how the Lawrence family were treated and so on, which is absolutely right. But actually the police are trying to prevent those women from taking those undercover cops to court on Tuesday. And I would urge people to come to the protest they called at 9 o'clock outside the Royal Courts of Justice just down the road to show solidarity and make sure that they don't get away with it.
Thank you all for being really patient and being really quick with your contributions. Just a couple of announcements before I bring the speakers back very briefly in reverse order, if that's okay, to speak and to come back on their one or two favourite points that were brought up in the discussion. One is that we've got one copy of the ISR left. This is the Journal of the International Socialist Organisation, which well,
you could auction it.
I'm going to plug it anyway because the content is also online and you should check it out, because Tiddy's article on explaining gender violence in the neoliberal era is in here, which is also online. So Shanice has taken this, but you're all free to check out the website. The other thing I wanted to flag up for people was that we're RS21, we're holding a whole political weekend. So if you like this meeting, you've got a whole weekend of different meetings to choose from. On the 29th and the 30th of March. We're going to have whole sessions. It will be a time to kind of extend this discussion further, because we haven't really had enough time to get into the depths of social reproduction theory, of all the things that people talked about. There will be whole sessions dedicated to social reproduction theory at this weekend. So there's flyers for them everywhere, but if you want to talk to any of us more about it, then come and chat to me and take some flyers. And hopefully a mailing list has gone round. If you're interested in getting involved locally, we've got RS21 groups, whether you're in North London, East London, South London, maybe West London. So get in touch with me or some of the other people at the end, and the boss over there is waving the sign-up list. So if you're interested in getting involved locally and coming to more meetings like this, please do talk to someone and write your email address down. So if I can bring back Sarah first.
Yeah. So for you, the question of empowerment. So one of the things that gave us faith while we were doing this type of work is that some of the women who were exposed to sexual violence, after they have been recovered afterwards, they joined the movement. So not all of them, of course, but some of them. So this is one thing. And for Hannah, I don't know, where is Hannah?
Next door.
She's watching it. Okay, perfect. So for Hannah, I think you misunderstood me in the first place, because when I started the conversation, I mentioned that I would speak about Egypt, not about the globe. So when I was saying that sexual harassment is culturally embedded in our society, because over 80% of the Egyptian women have been harassed, okay? So that doesn't mean that I'm saying that there is no patriarchal global system. That doesn't mean that. Because at first, I was very clear that I would focus on sexual violence in Egypt. This is my first point. My second point regarding Lara Logan, I think, again, you misunderstood me, because I said that I will shed the light on some of the examples of sexual violence, and then I mentioned towards the end that there are plenty of examples that have took place. But of course, I won't have enough time to go over each example in order. So I just picked 3 major examples before going and speaking about the Pantish. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Okay, and if I could bring back Chiki next.
Oh, okay. Thanks. So to answer the question about whether sexual violence is more relevant in Native American communities, well, of course not. The point that I was trying to make was that that often in the struggles within these communities there is a separation out, that there must be a struggle for sovereignty, which is against the American state, and once we win sovereignty, we will take care of the women's question. So one of the first people who makes this argument, one of the more prominent people who make this argument is a man called Ward Churchill, who actually has a very, very good position, a series of progressive positions on other things, and had fought relentlessly against the racism that American society displays towards Native American communities. However, this is Ward Churchill's position. However, this is not the position of several women's groups within Native American communities, of whom Andrea Smith is talking about. One of the most leading groups about this is Insight, and people should look at their website. And their argument is that the two are conjoined fights. We cannot fight for sovereignty of our people, a fight for decolonization, by delinking that from the fight against gender justice. It's a twin fight. So that was the point. On Indo's question, I mean, it will require a long time to go into it, but I think Hannah put her finger on it, that the process of capital accumulation may appear to be gender neutral, but capitalist social relations are certainly not gender neutral. So, and in fact, if you look at the process of capital accumulation itself, is not value neutral in that sense. I mean, slavery is a particularly important example to look at. So, can it do without oppression? I think Irene, I'm forgetting her last name, has a very good article actually in one of the first series of the International Socialist Journal. I'm forgetting her last name. Borrego, that's right. And basically she argues is, look, if capitalism was a stable system, then perhaps in the long run, perhaps it could invest in childcare infrastructure and so on and so forth. But for it to do that, it would need a stability which the system just doesn't have. So, I mean, it is much easier. And it would also lose out on the social relations, i.e. how you divide the working class. So in both those respects, one, the system is systematically not stable enough to do it, and it doesn't benefit the system to do it. So there is no reason why it should. I want to just end with the one comment about the migrant worker, because a comrade there brought that up, and I think that is absolutely significant, because the bulk of the migration today is from the global south to the global north, and this is all related to care work, the way the industry is broken up. But the migrant worker, if you think about it, is the quintessential worker that neoliberal capitalism loves, okay? Because most often she, is actually without any rights within the civil society. There are not even rights for juridical power that the worker has, which actually lessens completely her power within the workplace. So this is why, despite all this thing about, closing the borders, etc., capitalist bosses are perfectly fine to let people come under the radar and keep the borders closed so that the migrant worker is completely without power within the workplace. And I think some of the struggles that we will see will spark off in these regions. But we can't predict whether it's going to be in the migrant workplace or in the union place. Often it is from positions of strength that our class fights. So we cannot predict where it is, but I think it's one of the key arenas of struggle in the coming years.
Yeah. So today we have discussed a lot about theoretical tools. We have theoretical tools now that we can bring to the streets. So I would like to ask you to be involved in the campaign My Debt is Mine, and in all these struggles where there is a very component of class and gender. Somebody's agreed there. And like, for example, the strikes of cleaners here in Soles and also in other places as well. I want to to let you know that it's also really important to fight against racism, and one of the main campaigns now, it's the campaign of Justice for Mark Gargan, that's in North London, but also in different parts of London. So I would just ask you to come to the next demonstrations that we will do for the abortion rights in the Spanish state, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. I'll just finish really quickly, and I hope that people have enjoyed the meeting, because I think the most important thing to go away from isn't the potential sense of doom and gloom about the state of the situation at the moment, because when Howard said that women entered the workforce at a point of defeat, and that's true, and the past might weigh very negatively against us in terms of the level of organisation in Britain, in the workplace, in the trade unions, and in our campaigns in our communities. But one of the strengths for us at the moment is that few people today will accept a system that doesn't take gender equality and gender justice as a crucial thing. And this is one of the things that gives us potential to see lots of fightbacks in lots of different arenas in times to come. So I think just to end quickly, to come back to Sarah's point, it's important that we break down the idea, the kind of traditional distinction that's seen with Marxists focusing on the class struggle and other people focusing elsewhere. This isn't actually historically true, but particularly at the moment, although we think that a fight can only ultimately be won at the point of production in the workplace, it's certainly not the only place that the fight back and struggle is happening, and we as socialists need to be part of struggles wherever we see them. So hope you enjoyed the meeting. Thanks for being here.